Welcome, everybody. This is James Leichter from Aptora. This is another internal training session where we train our coworkers at RA Tax and Accounting. Welcome, and our staff at Aptora. Every week we do internal training. We decided to make these videos available to our users. They're not Hollywood productions. If I mess up, and I do, I don't fix them. We don't fix them. We just post them. Hopefully you'll find them useful. Today, we're going to be talking about memorized transactions and the reminders that are related to those. So let's just dig right into it. Let me close this. You can have those things come up by default. Let's open up our invoice list, just so we have it in front of us. And let's open up an invoice. So here we have an invoice that I want to memorize. In other words, I want this to recur. I want it to regenerate every month, we'll say. And how would I do that? Well, the first step is to create an invoice. And once we've done that, we can then memorize it. Now, I should say that this memorize feature exists all over the software. You can memorize sales, estimates, bills, adjusting journal entries, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty much anything that has to do with money can be memorized, meaning it can regenerate, auto-generate on a schedule of your choice. Let's click Memorize. A form comes up, pretty easy to understand. Give it a name, invoice for something. We'll say for, maybe it's for monthly maintenance. So just give it a quick name, as I'll do here. And then under description, you can give it a much better description, which I would. I'm not going to, but I normally would give it a very good description. Now, this invoice is going to generate itself. But do we want to have a reminder? Do we want to be reminded of this? You have three options: no reminder, remind me, or just automatically create it. So in other words, no reminder means I will remember this. I'll come back and approve its generation. Or before you generate this, I want to be reminded, because I might say no. Or just automatically do it. Don't bother me with it. So I'll say remind me. When do you want this to start? And it might be on the 1st of next month. And how often do you want to create it? Every day, every week, every 2 weeks, every month? In this case, we'll say monthly. Now, I can't have this go on forever. I have to give it an end date. The end date can be a long time from now, and it's easy to redo this, but I do have to give it an end date. That's a common question. Can I have this go on forever until they cancel? Yes, but you have to give it some end date. It can just be far in the future. Now, when this generates, do you want it to generate on whatever calendar day this falls on? Or would you like it to be the next business day? So if it happens to fall on a Saturday or a Sunday, do you want it to be the next business day? Probably. I can't speak for you, but for me, yes. Now, we did say we want to be reminded. So the software wants to know who. Who do you want to remind? I want to remind Ashley, and maybe she'll be on vacation. So I'm going to also remind an alternative, and maybe that's Bob. And don't forget to click the reminders. It generates the reminders here, and we're going to see where they are in a minute. You have an opportunity to mark any of these as completed. And what that would do is it would skip reminding that person. So you might say, for example, that I know I don't need to remind Bob, so I could mark that as completed, or I could just get rid of that particular reminder. I know he's not going to be there that day. So you can mark them as completed or delete any of these reminders. Bob's going to be on vacation on this day. I'm getting rid of that. The other reason you might want to mark these as completed is maybe you're backdating this. Maybe this has already been going on for a couple of months and you're just now getting around to memorizing it. You could mark it as completed and give it a completion date if you needed to. It's going to default to today. And that's it. You would click OK. And that has been memorized. So every month on a Monday, this invoice will generate, but it won't generate automatically. It will remind the person. And you can see pending reminders. I have 92 here. Let's click on that. Look at all these reminders. In this case, it's going to remind me first. And if I don't say, yes, go ahead, it will not generate that transaction. You may not want that. You may want it to just generate automatically, and you'll go deal with it. Now that we've done that, where do we find this memorized transaction? Well, it's an invoice that hasn't been created yet, so it's not going to be on the invoice list. It actually has not been created yet. It will get created later. But if you want to know more about the memorized transactions, you can go to the memorized transaction list. And this is a list of all transactions that have been memorized. So you can see that I've memorized a bill, an invoice, a check, a bill, a sale. Now remember, these aren't invoices. These are memorized transactions. This is a little confusing. If you were to double click on one of these, you're not actually opening the invoice. You're opening the memorized transaction. And you can edit this. Maybe you want to change it. Maybe you want to change the reminders. Maybe an employee has left and you want to get rid of that employee. You want to add a different one. So these are the memorized transactions that will recreate themselves. What about the reminders? As I mentioned, when I open this, I can see the reminder settings here, but the actual reminders show up in the reminder list. Come down to reminder list right here. Let's open one of those up. So here is the memorized transaction and the list of reminders that went with it. So that's another way to see that memorized transaction and the reminders that went with it. And if you want to see the actual reminders, then you would come down to the reminder list, and that will show you all of, whoops, I clicked the wrong thing. Do that again. That will show you all of the various reminders that are going to be happening. So here we have a bill and the reminders. Now, if you right click, you have some options. You can create new, edit, you can view the transaction. That's important because a lot of people expect to see the transaction here. If you click that, that will actually take you to the transaction, which you might want to modify. The memorized transaction builds from the original. Now, in this case, it's a paid bill. I wouldn't want to change that. I'd probably redo it if I had to. I would redo the transaction. So I might right-click here, and I might want to get rid of it. I can also generate the transaction, and I can mark it as complete. So remember, we created the memorized transaction from the invoice, and we chose to give it a reminder. All right, so let's close these things and recap this real quick. First thing we did is memorized an invoice and saved and closed. Now what? Well, when we log in next time, we might have a pop-up reminder, or a reminder will show up right here. telling us that we have a transaction. You can double click it here if you'd like to, and you can see the memorized transaction. You also can come to the company menu, come down to your memorized transaction list. This will allow you to see all of your memorized transactions, but remember, it doesn't show you the bill or the invoice. It shows you the work you did to memorize it, this form here. Memorize transaction. This one says automatically enter, so it will automatically enter it. Back to company. So we saw the memorized transaction list. We can look at the reminder list. Open that up. What am I looking at? I'm looking at the actual memorized transaction reminders. So you can see these boxes are checked and the reminders are down here. And then finally, the reminder item list. Best way to explain it is just to open it. So here we have a memorized transaction. Automatically enter. We have the various people who are going to be reminded. How does this differ from the other one? You can see there's a lot more records in here, and they seem to be repeating themselves. That's because you're looking at the actual reminder, the reminder itself. So you can see the sale will be generated on this day, and Karen, Andrew, Melissa, Bob, they're getting reminded. You can right-click and you can generate that transaction or just get rid of that reminder. Are you sure? Yeah. The only thing you did is you got rid of the reminder, so you're not reminding him about that transaction. That's it. If you want to get rid of the transaction, then you would go to the memorized transaction list and you would delete it. You've probably seen generate transaction. I think I mentioned that earlier. You can actually generate it early if you want to. So that's memorized transactions. As I mentioned, it's on other parts of the software, it operates identically. So there's no reason to go to, say, the journal entry list and teach you how to memorize an adjusting journal entry, because it is the exact same procedure. So if you know how to do one, you know how to do all of them. If you mess up and you start creating transactions that you didn't mean to, that's not too big a deal, because you can generally delete those transactions, assuming you have permission. You can delete them or void them, and you can fix your work pretty quickly. That is the whole story of memorized transactions and the reminders that go along with them. I guess I should say one more thing. The reminders don't have to be associated with memorized transactions. You can create a new reminder from scratch. This right here has nothing at all to do with a memorized transaction. It's just a reminder. That's all it is. So it could be a reminder to keep your eye out on an asset, maybe an oil change at 10,000 miles. It could be a reminder for any purpose, and it could remind anybody. So they don't have to be associated with memorized transactions. All of this functions in Aptora Mobile 2, our mobile product, the mobile app. You can create reminders. Reminders will go off. So this feature does exist in the mobile component as well. Were there any questions or comments about memorized transactions or reminders? You can unmute yourself if you need to. Okay, like I said, I'm James Leichter, and this was internal product training for Aptora and RA Tax and Accounting. We do this every week. We make a video out of it, and we post these on YouTube for the benefit of all of our users. And I hope you found it useful. Please let us know if there's any topics that you would like to see, and we would be happy to do those as well. Thank you, everybody.